Visit us online at www.kansas.gov.
Hello and welcome to Kansas Week. My name is Tim Brown. The Iowa caucuses are over and the candidates are heading for New Hampshire. Mike Huckabee and Barack Obama both rolled to big wins. 8 in 10 voters for Huckabee described themselves as born-again Christians or evangelical Christians. On the Democrat side, more than a third of those who cast ballots for Obama were under the age of 30. What does this all mean for candidates? Well, we'll ask our experts and they will tell us all about that. Starting with our first expert, we have Bob Beatty, professor of political science with Washburn University. Next to him is Lou Heldman, former president, CEO and publisher of the Wichita Eagle, now with Wichita State University, and Dave Seaton, editor and publisher of the Winfield Courier. And guys, we're just going to jump into it. First of all, welcome. We appreciate you being here. Let's start off. Let's talk a little bit about the results. And Bob, we'll start with you. I don't know that these were huge surprises considering the polling that we'd seen recently, but if you would have said 6 months ago that Obama was going to win, for example, I think people would have looked at you twice.
Well, yeah, we have to put this into context, Tim, in that several years ago, the only people that knew Barack Obama and Mike Huckabee were their families. Now, of course, that's not really true, but not only are they relative unknowns, they have sort of silly, goofy-sounding last names. They don't sound presidential.
Exactly.
And that's important, and the media sort of takes these people seriously. Look at Fred Thompson. Just because he decided to think about getting in the race, he received all that media attention. But we can talk about this more later, but having seen Obama and Huckabee in Iowa in action, I got to see how it is that they convince people, their arguments, and both of them have very endearing personalities that paid off for them in Iowa.
You know, Bob, I was listening to the radio this morning, and there was a report on that really kind of struck me. I thought this was very interesting. They said, these are interesting times we live in when you have a black man with a sinister-sounding name winning in a state like Iowa. And, you know, I think that's a good point.
It is, although I've done, I won't call it research, but I've looked up, and Huckabee, if he was elected, would be the strangest sounding, or goofiest, some would say, last name. And Millard Fillmore was not elected. He took over for a dead president. But what I was struck by when attending events by Barack Obama and Mike Huckabee is that it was like going to church. And I've been to different church services over the years, different styles, different types of churches. But when I first saw Mike Huckabee and he started talking, I thought, I feel like I'm in church. And also with Barack Obama, the way they present their arguments. And this was appealing to different constituencies. For the Democrats, Obama was appealing to that style, the Democrats wanting sort of a hope, a faith, to believe in something. With Huckabee, the evangelicals in Iowa are very strong, 60% of the turnout evangelicals, and I think many of them felt like that their minister was running for president, and they trusted him. And they didn't trust Mitt Romney and John McCain and others because, you know, they've been in the political game a little too long, but they really liked Mike Huckabee.
You know, it's interesting, Lou, let's talk a little bit about the media in Iowa and how that works. First of all, there was a huge crush of media on the state.
It's very hard to differentiate yourself if you're in the media because there are so many.
So you have this huge pack that basically descends on this small Midwestern state, and to me it's fascinating. I was actually up there over Christmas and watching the coverage and watching just what was happening in the state I thought was quite interesting. The whole process is interesting, but it's almost confusing at times. Are we doing too much up there?
Well, it's not that anyone is doing too much, it's that there are so many doing something. The most interesting thing that's been changing in campaigns is disintermediation, which is a long way of saying that there are fewer filters between information and consumers of information. And I can follow this entire campaign on blogs now. I don't need the networks at all, and in fact I wouldn't be watching them except for Tim Russert. And when you have a brand like Tim Russert, that's the way to differentiate yourself, with insight. And everyone is looking for someone to trust, whether it's the Daily Cause or Chris Matthews or whomever, because they give you a framework that you understand around a candidate.
Going with what you're saying, we're going to talk about some of the strategies that the various candidates use in just a moment. But first, before we get too much deeper in this, let's go ahead and put our graphics up there that show our winners and losers and the percentage. We'll start with the Democrats if we can. Obama, of course, had the support of, I believe, 38% of the voters compared to 30% for Edwards and 29% for Hillary Clinton. And Bill Richardson took up the kind of the end there. Any surprises there for any of you three gentlemen?
Well, I think that when you see Dodd and Biden, who are smart guys, spend a year of their life and make so little impact, that's a surprise that they couldn't get on the board at all.
And they've both dropped out now.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Bill Richardson probably got around 8 to 9%. Mm-hmm. But because of the Democratic rules, you had to get 15% for viability. And in these caucuses, if you didn't have 15%, supporters could move to another candidate. Mm-hmm. And so I would guess Richardson probably had maybe 6 to 8%.
Bob, explain that to us, because the Republicans and the Democrats do things a little differently in the Iowa caucuses. Republicans, right, you get one shot. Democrats, if you don't hit that 15% mark, you get a vote again, basically.
Right. The Republicans, basically, somebody gets up for the candidate and gives a speech and says, vote for our candidate, and then they take a vote and they just write their candidate who they support on a little piece of paper and put it in an envelope. Some people were frightened by that when they saw it on C-SPAN. The Democrats, you get in these groups, and then you go through this 15% viability, and let's say there's a candidate with only 8%. The other groups will say, hey, come over here, come over here. Mm-hmm. Dennis Kucinich, for example, probably polling at about 1 or 2%, told his people, go ahead to Obama. Mm-hmm. And that makes it a little more difficult to assess, as we were saying, the true support. The Republicans, it's easier because we saw McCain 13%, Thompson 13%. We didn't see that in the Democrats, and so that's both Biden and Dodd have already dropped out because of that process.
Dave, let's talk for a minute about the money that's spent in Iowa. We don't, of course, have exact figures, but it's tens of millions of dollars. It's a lot of money in that state in a relatively short period of time. And, I think one thing that Huckabee said was this was proof that people are more important than dollars. Just throwing dollars at something isn't going to work. And maybe he's right. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that the outcome of this caucus really does show you that authenticity and personable qualities, hard work, of course, can defeat money, big money. Mm-hmm. I'm not really up on the total amounts, but we were talking earlier that it might have been $75 million or more, and some of the candidates were spending as much as $15 million. And I think that if you look closely, what you almost see is that some of the people who were scripted and spending great deals of money on television ads didn't do as well as expected, and that, of course, hurts you in Iowa. If you look back to 1972, when Gary Hart used the Iowa caucuses to get his candidate, George McGovern, a lot of media coverage. There's a lot, the media has a great deal to do with the Iowa caucuses and the bounce that they give in later primaries. So I think that all that spending, in a way, it appears to me, almost clogged the system. Mm-hmm. But indeed, it's the system that we've got, and most of the party leadership seem to be satisfied with it.
How relevant is Iowa?
Well, it seems to me generally it's very relevant because it's first. Mm-hmm. And it's relevant because the news media pays so much attention to it. For a lot of us, it's fewer than 20% of the electorate in that state, and it's a state that is not altogether typical of the country by any means. But it is it's retail politics of the first order. I think most of us still believe in that, especially in this age dominated by the media.
Well, as Dave said, they're really playing to two audiences. They're mm-hmm. playing to the local audience, but last night, if you were watching all of the speeches, they're all playing to the national audience. Mm-hmm. And the value of Iowa and New Hampshire is they get to try a lot of things out before they go broad.
That's an excellent point right there. I think using Iowa and New Hampshire kind of as testing ground, proving grounds, I guess you could say, for some of the different tactics, and I think that's an interesting point. Let's talk a little bit more about retail politics, Lou, and you know, if you own a television station or a newspaper in the state of Iowa, you're pretty happy this time of year, I imagine.
Well, you're a lot happier if you own a television station. Newspapers get a very, very small percentage, and the reason for that is that newspapers give you too much for free because they cover the race, they run the candidate statements, they do a lot of things that television doesn't do, and it's an environment that the candidates can only appeal to people who are already intelligent and following the issues, whereas television gets a lot of people who are watching politics by accident.
Sure.
On behalf of us beleaguered editorial writers, I would add that the endorsement by the Des Moines Register of Obama really did make a difference in this case, as I understand it.
Explain that to me. How much of a difference do you think that did make?
Well, they
And
had
why?
endorsed Edwards in the previous presidential caucuses, and there was some expectation that they might, I don't know if they were expected to stick with him, but the timing was quite good at the time, as Bob was saying. When people are looking for someone to sort of congeal their thinking in, someone they can trust, that newspaper editorial, I believe, played that role for a lot of people in Iowa. And I was glad to see that, frankly.
Well, and I also think it said something important to the national media because they were paying so much attention to what the Register was going to do.
You know, one of the things that I was reading when strategists were looking at Obama versus Clinton, and Clinton was the experienced voice, Obama was the agent for change, and that message may be sent loud and clear, I guess, to the Democratic Party now. Would you agree?
Well, looking at some of the numbers of the exit polls, I think it's interesting that really what we saw in Iowa was candidate-focused campaigns. Especially on the Democratic side, they don't really disagree on the issues. The Republicans actually have some serious disagreements. So much so that Rudy Giuliani and John McCain, Giuliani especially, sort of skipped Iowa because they feared they just couldn't compete. But looking at the entrance polls, Mike Huckabee got 36% of voters who said that illegal immigration was their #1 concern. So that means 36% of voters went in and said, my #1 issue is illegal immigration, but I'm going to vote for Huckabee anyway because he is not very popular among the ardent anti-illegal immigration people. So it's really people in Iowa were looking at the candidates and sort of checking them out. And I think that's part of the whole Iowa process. And I was there just a few days before the caucus, and Barack Obama quizzed the crowd and said, how many of you are going with caucusing with me? And a bunch of hands rose. And then he said, how many of you undecided? And 1/3 of the audience, and I was shocked, raised their hand. And I thought, it's really amazing to me that after a year and 200 visits by several of the candidates. Yeah, it's almost to the point where I think many people made up their minds and then went back and said, I need to see Hillary, Obama, Edwards all 3 more times. And that means they're really checking out the candidates themselves. And this is not going to happen really much more. After New Hampshire, this is going to stop. Because you get into Super Tuesday, and we have, 22 states, and it's going to be mostly TV advertising.
And it's not, obviously, not the kind of time can be spent in those states as the candidates spend
maybe
in
one
Iowa.
or 2 big events.
That's interesting. You know, the whole Iowa process to me is fascinating, and it's almost like a sport up there, or a sporting event throughout the year. I think there's a lot of pageantry associated with it, a lot of excitement. You know, Bob, you were up there for several of the events, and you had remarked on, on past shows, on some of these little venues that folks went to, and of course the great big venues. And you even said to me before the show started that, I think your question was, where's the tipping point? And your statement was, we've reached it and gone beyond it.
That's right. I was in Iowa 4 years ago, and I didn't feel this way. But after being in Iowa this time, it's gone too far. The media especially, but also the candidates, it's too much. And as I said, maybe it only takes 100 visits for people to figure out who they support. And what can we do about it? Well, I would think something like a regional primary or caucus involving Kansas, keep Iowa, Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, maybe get Oklahoma and Missouri in there. And then instead of, Mitt Romney estimated he visited Iowa about 250 times. Maybe he visits Iowa 90 times and goes to Kansas 30 times, Nebraska 30, Missouri 100. And I think it could work. I just think we've become such a big country, the media is so big. I give the analogy, it's like having the Super Bowl in Topeka. Not that Topeka wouldn't love to have it, but it's not going to happen. And so
Sure.
why are we having this, the first caucus in Iowa?
Bob, are you thinking, excuse me, Jim,
Sure, go ahead.
of a rotating regional primary that would maybe have 4 national regions?
Well, that's been one of the proposals. I think Iowa would, you know, go crazy if they were never the first. So maybe the first proposal would be Iowa, you have to join a regional. And maybe you're right. Maybe it's a rotating regional primary and Iowa always gets to participate, even if it's the western one.
These are exactly the kinds of ideas that political scientists and journalists think make a lot of sense, and they don't work. And the reason they don't work is because of the ritual involved. The ritual here is the washing of the feet. And so this is the washing of the feet of the common people in Iowa and New Hampshire, and every candidate who wants to be taken seriously at the very beginning has to do it. And I think maybe the primary system was developed by the same people who developed the college bowl system.
Yeah, people are demanding change there, too. That's an interesting analogy.
But I might add, too, I think that party leadership today seems really biased in favor of these early primaries. Both parties, although with some resistance, have allowed these February 5th, what really is almost a national primary to take place. And I understand it's partly because they like to get it settled so they can start the general election campaign and hope to win.
Yeah, 22 states on February 5th. And that brings up the whole issue of Rudy Giuliani, who's gambling because he's skipping, I mean, it looks to be he's skipping Iowa, New Hampshire, Michigan, Nevada, South Carolina, and he's waiting for Florida. That's January 29th.
Why is he doing that?
Well, he made the estimation that he couldn't win Iowa, and that if he didn't win, it would hurt him, it would destroy him. And that's a gamble. I would argue that, you know, if he got second or third in Iowa, which I think he could have, now that we see what happened, he would be fine. But he just worried that he wasn't conservative enough for Iowa, which is a conservative primary state, caucus state.
Well, and in more ways than one, he, like Paul Morrison, is a prosecutor fueled by testosterone, and he doesn't like the washing of the feet aspect.
He's big events, right. I mean, he showed up at all the debates. I mean, he'll go to those, you're right.
Well, and Lou, you had kind of an interesting analogy before we started. You talked about it's time for the mice to kind of toy with the cat,
right?
Or the cats, and this is what we've seen here. They ran these people ragged. Actually, if we could bring some of Bob's photos up, and maybe Bob could kind of talk to those photos and tell us what we're seeing there. We don't have all of them. I apologize. That's my fault, Bob. You sent me more than what we can see, but we can pop them up in the big monitor here.
Well, what I'm not arguing to get rid of the Iowa caucuses, because the wonderful thing about Iowa is that anybody, including political scientists from Topeka, can go and see the candidates, you know, as close as we're sitting here, ask them questions. I sent my students up, 25 of them. They took video, many of them had questions, and they followed the campaigns around. So that's the beautiful thing in Iowa.
In fact, one of your students was at the Thompson speech. You mentioned this earlier, where he asked for applause, which was kind of an interesting situation.
Right, and yeah, he could have sent that quickly off to a media source and probably caused some trouble. And 4 years ago, one of my students was at a John Kerry event where he said, I voted against that before I voted for it, and didn't even know what he had, because that was on video. But that's wonderful. But what I'm saying is that you can still have that. And there's diminishing returns to 250 visits. You can still go to Iowa, see the candidates up close, but maybe also be able to do it in Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. But as you mentioned, maybe that'll happen when there's a playoff system in college football.
Have you all seen Barack Obama's victory speech on video? You know, it's something I think that will be talked about for quite a while, partly because it expressed this generational, hopeful sense of let's try it another way, and let's work together. You know, this man who's got mixed race, who comes from Kansas, strange upbringings in was it the Philippines? He really is an Indonesia, an unexpected symbol, I think, of this sort of Kennedy-esque charisma.
And his mother is a Kansan, is that correct?
Yeah. She was born in Wichita.
Yeah.
In Wichita, okay.
But that speech was like Ronald Reagan's Morning in America, in a way. It was a new departure, I think, in American politics.
Well, both Obama and Huckabee really didn't go negative, and are very hopeful in their campaign. Obviously, Obama's whole theme was hope, but Obama, you know, he has an office in Lawrence, and they want to contest Kansas. And if that's the case, what he's thinking is not just win the nomination, but maybe a national campaign that can include people that may not normally get involved in political campaigns, obviously the young people.
In fact, on one of our previous shows, I think somebody brought up the point that Obama, it may have been you, Bob, had a couple of staffers, I believe, paid staffers here in Kansas, which was a little bit of a surprise.
Oh, it's a big surprise that anybody would compete in Kansas. But in Iowa, Obama won 57% of 17 to 29-year-olds. Now, as a political scientist, I would say that's maybe not so good, because those people don't vote in general
you don't bank
elections.
on them. They're going to come to the caucus, but they're not going to show up at the
That
booth.
would be his gamble. It's interesting, Jim Ryan, who's running for the 2nd District Congress here in Kansas, has argued that, well, I will do better this election because we'll have a lot more Republicans running. And then he said he was sort of banking on Hillary getting the nomination and saying this will bring turnout for Republicans who want to vote against Hillary. Well, what if your point, you know, is there's something to your point that actually, if Obama gets the nomination and you get this upsurge of sort of people that don't normally vote, and that offsets a Republican turnout effort.
It could really be a bad moment for Republicans, I'm afraid. Obama brought out almost 100,000 independent new voters who hadn't participated in previous caucuses in Iowa. If he continues to do that and this appeal really catches on, then it'll be very difficult, I think, for anybody in the Republican side, whether it be Giuliani or Huckabee or someone else. How are they going to run against that? That's a tough one.
It is hard, because if you go negative and that candidate like Obama has established himself as positive and hopeful, the negatives can bounce back pretty quickly.
Guys, we've got about 3 minutes left, and I want to talk about a few of the different candidates and their futures. We really haven't talked too much about Hillary Clinton today, and I think, you know, again, if we would have had this show 6 months ago, people would have been a little bit surprised with this outcome. What happens now? What does she need to do?
I think she laid the groundwork for that last night. The first thing she did was move much closer to Obama. She's now the change candidate, if you listened to her last night. The way she comes across, some people find very programmed. I, in fact, thought that she was much more natural and appealing last night than I'd ever seen her. The difficulty is that she has all these hot button issues, and she tries to hit each one in every speech. And that's the part that comes across as very forced, whereas Obama comes across as very inspirational, even while doing the same thing.
And I think that Obama has found her weakness, which is the possibility that she would be a divisive candidate and possibly a divisive president. And his theme is unity.
Unity, absolutely.
And he's mentioned that in his speeches. He doesn't go negative, but he's mentioned that it's tough to have 50% of the people who say they're against you, which is some of the polls show for Hillary Clinton. She has to overcome that.
Let's talk about Romney for a minute. What does he need to do? He spent a bucket load of money, but it didn't really pay off.
Well, he needs to get to a place, New Hampshire may be that place, where people are much more like him, that they don't have the large turnout of evangelicals. It's not clear to me how big a factor the Mormonism was, but clearly the evangelicals played in Huckabee's favor.
Dave?
Well, I think being a neighbor does matter in primaries, and it matters in politics generally. And he is a neighbor to New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. He's well known there. You know, all the television really emanates from Boston. Governor of Massachusetts, although he has his critics in both parties, I'm aware. But I think in New England, he looks like he just walked out of Brooks Brothers most of the time. That won't be so bad in New England as it might have been in rural Iowa.
Yeah, I think...
you don't think those pink sweaters go over well?
I'm not so sure they do.
I think Iowa delivered sort of a body blow to Mitt Romney, and it didn't floor him, but he really was counting, obviously with up almost $15 million spent, on winning Iowa. And he looked it. You know, usually he looks very calm and collected, but you could tell he just said this was not part of the plan to lose, not only lose Iowa, to lose to Mike Huckabee. That was just not part of the Romney business model for Iowa, which he had laid out, 3 years ago.
Do you think this is a good wake-up call for him?
Well, it's a good question. That's what Iowa does. Did it to Ronald Reagan. He shook up his whole staff and went on to win the nomination. But
Romney has recovered quickly. He's saying now we need new faces in Washington, and I'm one of them.
I think it's way too early to count Obama and Huckabee in.
Yeah, I agree.
Sure.
Let's wait a few weeks on that.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate you being here tonight. You did a great job. We're just about out of time. We do have a few programming notes for our Kansas Week viewers. Next Friday, we'll have a State of the State preview on Kansas Week. That's a show you need to catch. The following Monday, January 14th, we will cover the Governor Kathleen Sebelius State of the State address in its entirety and have the Republican respond.
The farmers and ranchers of Kansas Farm Bureau take pride in producing food, fuel, and fiber for their neighbors in Kansas and around the globe. Kansas families, just like yours.
On January 23rd, marriage vowed on Fox.
Come on, Mr. Burns, keep moving.
We can't leave work till you do.
Oh, no, he's talking to that mailroom guy.
I hope he's not telling that stupid story about hang gliding again.